All right, welcome in to anyone watching either live or watching a recording of this later. We are in the Mercat cellar here at Blair Street, the Blair Street Underground Vaults at Mercat Tours. My name is Lindsay. I am on the marketing team and part of the support team as well here at Mercat. And with me, I have, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Tania. I am Creative Development Manager here at Mercat. So I work with all our fabulous storytellers and create content for the tours. Yeah.
Wonderful. And today we are here to talk about Scotland's witches and the real history behind Scotland's witches, which is very exciting. So I guess we'll just jump right in. So viewers here might be familiar with the concept of the Scottish witch trials, or maybe the early European or modern European witch trials. But do you want to give us a little bit of context as to what the so-called witch craze was in the 16th and 17th centuries, and then also maybe the role that Edinburgh specifically played in it?
Yeah. So obviously it's a massive subject. But here in Scotland, in 1563, we had the first Witchcraft Act created, and we can maybe go into a bit about what that is, but essentially it meant that witchcraft was punishable by death, and that lasted until a period of about 200 years of people being accused of witchcraft and many people being executed for witchcraft. And there were various peaks, which we tend to call panics, which tied in with various events in Scottish history that were going on. But from the figures, the information that we have, we've realised that we were very prolific here in Scotland. So we have names of almost 4,000 individuals who were swept up in this witchcraft panic, and we believe, we don't have all the records of executions, but we can make educated estimates that there were around 2,500 people executed as witches in Scotland. So that puts us as 5 times the European average per capita. And here in Edinburgh, although we didn't have many witches ourselves, depending on how you count it and how you class Edinburgh at the time, it could be as few as 9. But people were brought to Edinburgh from lots of surrounding areas because we here had the courts that we did, the lawyers that we did, the experience apparently that we did. So that meant that huge numbers, hundreds of people were having their interrogations happening here in Edinburgh, and many of them were executed here in Edinburgh as well.
That is very interesting and mildly horrific
Yes.
to hear. So I guess we have a lot of kind of preconceptions as a society as to what would have led to an accusation of witchcraft. What could have led to someone being accused of that?
Yeah, there are all kinds of things that could have led to that. Sometimes I think we can get caught up a bit too much in the mythical side of it. We think about, if you're just left-handed, that was enough. If you had red hair, that was enough. If you were caught talking to your cat, that was enough. You had a familiar. In actual fact, although these things might be part of a bigger picture, if you look at the records that we have where we know why people were executed, what was being used as evidence, it wasn't all healers, for example. The most common one seems to be quarrels. So if, for example, you had an argument with one of your neighbours in a fairly public setting, and that person had then gone home and they developed a fever, or let's say their cow stopped producing milk or as much milk the next day, then people would think back to this argument that they'd had and think, oh, that person must have affected me because they were angry with me. And so an awful lot of what led to these accusations was just day-to-day life, and maybe being argumentative, perhaps having a reputation. So if you were known to be, we have a fabulous story from here. I say fabulous story as in to get into all these examples. The poor woman Agnes Finney, who was a very, very argumentative shopkeeper, and when you read some of these things against her, you think this may well have just been a kind of hot-headed businesswoman who was trying to get by, and the things that she said led to her being accused of witchcraft. So you didn't have to be dancing around in the forest around a fire, although if you did do that, then that could get you accused. I was reading recently about a man who accused 3 women. He'd seen them dancing around a fire, and the next day his horse died. So that obviously meant that there was witchcraft involved, because obviously that's what that is. So although some of them have these the kind of stereotypical images that we might have seen portrayed in media, and sometimes all you needed was a bit of a reputation or a bit of a strong personality, and that could lead to all kinds of accusations.
Yeah, and was it only women who's being accused, or were there men who were accused during this time as well?
Absolutely, men as well. Yeah, absolutely. Not as many. So the figures that we have tell us, so all those names that I mentioned, of course, we can't always tell if that would have been a male or female. Sometimes it's not obvious, but at least 84% of them are women, or were women. But that means, yes, that absolutely were male witches, and they were called witches as well at the time. People talk about warlocks or wizards, but generally they were perceived as a witch as well.
Interesting. And I know I've heard, and maybe anyone who's viewing here has also heard, rumors of people who had a working knowledge of either scientific or possibly folk medicine or healing could have been accused. Is that true?
Yes, yeah, it absolutely is. There are a lot of those cases, people using healing medicine, people using charms. Interesting though, it's not the majority. I think that's an idea that we've come to develop, is that that's who most of these people were. There are theories that this was in a way punishing those who had that knowledge, so that it could be held by the few with money and who were charging for their services. But of those records that we have, only 9% actually have some kind of healing or midwifery associated with the charges against them. But they are absolutely things. So when you read through this database that was created by the University of Edinburgh, where they collated all these sources, you can find amazing examples of people, curing people, using charms, using rituals, or just using what looks, to us like same medicine we use today. But yes, they are the minority.
Interesting. And so people who possibly utilized people who were accused of witches, who were healers, could they also be kind of persecuted under the Witchcraft Act just for utilizing someone's services?
Yes, so the Witchcraft Act stated that witchcraft, necromancy and sorcery were all punishable by death, not just the witch themselves, but the people who consulted with them. So there were, I believe, a great number of the Erskine family, who were quite a prominent family, they were executed at our Mercat Cross, actually, because they had consulted with witches.
That is, again, kind of horrifying. I mean, I'm sure anyone listening in here is interested in witchcraft or kind of the history of witches in Scotland. And it is very interesting, while also kind of horrific at the same time.
Yeah, especially when you consider that. So the point about healers especially is that a physician was an incredibly expensive thing to have. You would go to your local herbalist equivalent, rather than go to a physician. So yes, absolutely, in order to heal yourself, you were at risk.
Yeah, wow. And I'm sure there are parts of the city as well that maybe weren't able to access physicians of kind of the more official, quote-unquote type.
Absolutely.
So they may have had to turn to
absolutely that. Which is the case right up until very recent history, when you think about it. So yes, if your local wise woman was somebody who did get accused, then that could put the population in all kinds of trouble, I suppose, because they wouldn't have these people to then turn to. Yeah.
So kind of speaking on the socioeconomic, but also kind of societal situation at the time, what was going on in Scotland with there's a lot of religious upheaval at the time, right?
Yes, a lot. So again, we could, excuse me, coughing, we could go, there's several different peaks. But when it all starts is 1563, as I mentioned, and that's the Protestant Reformation, when John Knox is basically shifting the faith here in Scotland. So we'd been essentially a Catholic country for a very long time, and he brings in Protestant, he brings in the Presbyterian Church. So that is a huge, huge shift. And of course, not everybody wanted to leave their Catholicism behind. And the monarch at this time, for those who know, will already be smiling because it's Mary Queen of Scots, who was absolutely Catholic and had no intention of changing. And of course, this at that time, the church was, everybody was religious, everybody was Christian in some form here, essentially. So this was a major upheaval, and it affected so that these acts. So the Witchcraft Act, that's not just something that the church passes. This is, as I say, punishable by death. This is the church are literally laying down laws. So there was a lot of negotiation between the Crown and the Church and Parliament as well, in terms of who has what power. If we're shifting, if we're making these religious changes, then who can affect what powers over the people. So people were living in real, in this state of not really knowing what was coming a lot of the time, as well as being told that you have to change your faith. And there was this idea of godly discipline that came in with this, that we were meant to, in Scotland, be God's new kingdom on earth. This was the new Jerusalem. This was as closest as to heaven that you could get on earth, and that therefore everybody in Scotland had to live as godly life as possible. And you were responsible not just for your own behaviour, but the behaviour of your family. So you had to go home and make sure that your family were reading the Bible and eating only what they were meant to eat on the days that they were meant to eat it, and then you weren't working on the Sunday, and you weren't using icon. All these religious practices you had to be enforcing, essentially, and that involved everybody around you as well, so your neighbours. So everybody was living in this stage of looking out for anything that wasn't godly and knowing that they should report it. And of course that means that if we are going to be God's kingdom on earth, then God's enemies are going to want to influence that, which means we are going to attract the devil. The devil is going to want to be in Scotland, is going to be trying to infiltrate all of this and corrupt as many people as possible. So not only is everybody trying to be as godly as possible, and prove that their way is the right way, that they are worshipping correctly, they are also looking out for people who are with the devil and against them. So it really did. And then in later periods in the 1600s, we have monarchs trying to change the way that religion is practiced again. So we literally have periods of our history where the people and the king are literally fighting back. We have civil war, we have in the 1640s, on top of all of that, we've got famine and we've got plague. So it would have, for this period of time, a great deal of it would have felt apocalyptic in some ways to a lot of these people. And of course they're therefore looking for people to blame, or if someone turns around and says it's witchcraft, and people might even have a sense of relief because that's why everything's going wrong, it's because of witches, let's get rid of the witches and then things will be better, instead of actually thinking, oh well, maybe all this religious argument isn't doing us the best.
And speaking of monarchs and kind of their role in this, James VI played quite a large role in this, right?
So he, son of Mary Queen of Scots, was probably, safe to say, a very paranoid man, worried, obviously, after your mother being thrown off the throne and then beheaded. He would have been worried about conspiracies against him. He's going to inherit the throne of England, so he's a very powerful man. So he believed that there were all kinds of plots against him, including some witches that were against him. The North Berwick witch trials, an awful lot of that was directed, or he believed, towards him. And he started to personally interrogate a lot of these accused people. And he literally wrote the handbook. He wrote Demonology, which is basically a book about witches, the existence of witches, how to find them, and he considered himself the expert in this land on how to deal with witches, essentially. So yes, when that's at the top. So even though there was a man writing around the same time who was trying to disprove witchcraft, he's really interesting. He was even going to he was writing things in the book about, this is how you do this particular magic trick. This isn't witchcraft. It's literally like a kid's magic trick book that you would get today, saying that you can do this trick this way, and it's not witchcraft. But when the king is saying there are absolutely witches, and this is one, and this is one, and this is one, and I found them, then it was very hard to argue against that, right? Because he's the king. So that would have just fueled all this belief even more.
Yeah, and so, anyone who has been to Edinburgh and has spent maybe some time along the Royal Mile, which goes from the castle all the way down to the Palace of Holyrood House, you know that there are a lot of statues and monuments everywhere. I mean, we have Greyfriars Bobby, just near Greyfriars Kirkyard, which is a dog, and then we have a lot of men as well. Very, very few women. So is there anything in the city that commemorates all of these people? That you said, what, 82%?
84% female.
84%.
So yes and no. There is a beautiful object right up by the castle Esplanade. It's on the wall of the former reservoir. So it's called the Witch's Well. That was commissioned by Patrick Geddes, and it is a monument to those accused of witchcraft. And it, as I say, it's a beautifully crafted object. It has two sides of witchcraft on it, if you like. It has a kind of beautiful looking young woman and a kind of older haggard woman. It has herbs on it that are sleeping draughts or poisons, depending on the quantity you use. It's got the hands of healing on one side, the evil eye on the other. It has a snake which represents both healing but also, Eve's serpent. So it's telling the two sides of witches, if you like. However, as we've been talking about, there's far more to it. So this monument, although it's in quite a prominent place because it's very close, basically the Esplanade is where the majority of witches that were executed in the Edinburgh area, that's where the executions were carried out. So in some ways it's a very moving object in a very appropriate location, but it's small, and a lot of people have no idea it's there. It doesn't pay tribute to all of the stories. It focuses very much on this herbalism, which, as we've already talked about, that's the minority. It focuses only on the females, and although of course they are the majority of females, it's not something that says, we accused almost 4,000 people and potentially executed 2,500 people for belief in the devil, or we believed that these people worked with the devil at the time. So whether it's fitting, perhaps we should have something else. There is a current campaign, as I'm sure lots of people watching this may know about, that hopes that we can have a national memorial somewhere. Fingers crossed.
Yes. And I guess, so we know that obviously both men and women were accused of this. Is there any kind of specific stories of people that you've read about that really sticks out in your mind, or that you look forward to being able to tell the story of? Yeah,
there's so many, and every time I do a little delve I find more and more. There's just incredible stories out there. But the ones that we do on our tour so we decided that we would keep that to Edinburgh people, and that has been really interesting, looking into those who were accused in the city. There's less people accused in the city generally than in rural areas. So stories of Agnes Finney, who was the shopkeeper that I mentioned earlier, with apparently a bit of a temper on her. Her story is fascinating because she had about 20 charges of witchcraft against her, and it had taken 28 years for people to accuse her. So that in itself raises all these questions. Then there's Janet Boyman, who is one of those who considered themselves a healer. I believe she called herself a wise woman, but she's somebody who we talk about a ritual that she essentially carried out to heal people that is mentioned in her trial records. We have an actual example of her healing, and then we can talk about what happened to her. It didn't end well. And then we talk about the Weirs as well. Major Thomas Weir, who is quite the character, has quite a reputation to this day. Interestingly enough, it doesn't actually seem to have been technically executed as a witch, but everything that was going on at the time, and in that case, if it was anybody else, then they probably would have been pointed the finger at, and accused of witchcraft. And he's certainly, in Edinburgh memory, he's absolutely considered one of the worst of the witches. So we've got a real mixed bag of these stories on the tour.
I was just reading about Thomas Weir earlier, and let's just say that his life is not necessarily family friendly to talk about, so we probably won't dive into it here. It's very interesting kind of history, though. But I'm curious. So if you do go back and read through the archives and the kind of database that the University of Edinburgh has put together, which is phenomenal. If anyone wants to just spend some time looking through, they have an interactive map. It is just absolutely incredible. But you see in a lot of those trials and a lot of the information that they have that people actually admitted to being witches.
Yes.
And do we have any kind of theories as to why people would admit to that sort of thing?
Yeah, there's a lot of theories. For a start, and I'm sure a lot of people will be aware, a lot of these interrogations were physical interrogations. These people were essentially being tortured. So people would potentially say anything in order to make the pain, stop. We know that even from more modern day examples, when tortures are used, that people will just speak in order to make the pain lessen. They're not necessarily giving you the truth. There's also some of the interrogation methods that are used. So sleep deprivation was the most common here in Scotland, and if you go for long periods of time, in fact it doesn't even have to be that long. If you go for a few days without sleep, then it has all kinds of effects on you. And I'm sure somebody, one of our other storytellers, was comparing this the other day to having kids, and that when your kids are not sleeping and you've been up for days, then people will start to that your temper changes. You might eventually get to a stage where you are hallucinating, where you are delusional. So there's the possibility that people were believing the things they said, or just talking and not realising what they were saying. And I find it absolutely fascinating that in the trial records, what is recorded in terms of what the accused people say is down there, but not necessarily the questions that were asked. So we have no record of how leading these questions were. So, for example, there's a huge difference between somebody saying, "Tell me what happened on Sunday night down at the kirk," and somebody then suddenly coming out with all this information about devils and dancing and other people who were there. But if all that information is given to you, did you meet the devil in the kirk? Was Bessie there? Was Elizabeth there? Did you dance with the devil? Did the devil touch you? Did the devil ask you to do any of these? All that person then needs to say is yes. yes. So you can imagine that an awful lot of these people were saying these things because either they were trying to stop the pain, they were trying to escape the pain, or it was about self-preservation in a way to make this stop, to make it end, to make it to somehow think that, well, if I give you this, then my situation is going to improve, or it's pure delusion and they didn't know what they were saying. So all kinds of reasons, but I don't think any of these confessions were necessarily coming from places where they had made a decision that, oh no, I'm going to confess. We do know that later on in the 1660s, a man called George Mackenzie is starting to become a bit of an advocate for those that are being put through these trials, and he speaks to a woman who confesses, and she admits to him later that the reason she confessed was not because she believed she was a witch, far from it, but that she knew her neighbours believed she was a witch, so that if she was found innocent and she was then left to go and live her life, that her life would not be worth living because her neighbours would turn against her, she'd be ostracised, if she had any kind of life, it would need to be, picked up and started from scratch somewhere completely different. So she decided, no, I'm going to confess, because being presumably strangled and burned is going to be a better choice than carrying on with my life. So, yeah, lots of reasons why people confessed, and none of them pleasant.
Yeah, it's rather a heavy topic when you do get into the kind of true history of witches. And I'm very aware that we are drawing close to the end of our live stream. So thank you to anyone who's joined so far.
Yes.
And it's nice to kind of dive into that true history behind these, because I think, when someone says a witch, you typically think of, the pointy hat and the broomstick. Yeah. And there's a lot of kind of iconography that comes to mind when you think of that. But that terminology, witchcraft, has a very kind of specific dark history.
Yes.
Kind of horrific in Scotland's history. And so it's nice to be able to dive into that truth.
Absolutely. I think it's so important that we do it, because, as you say, the word witch now means something very different to us, including to myself. But to know that word was used the way it was for so long, that so many people were killed over this word, means we need to now go back and correct that. So the tour that we've created, which launches just now, like in April, on Saturdays, is hopefully going to start telling, well, it is going to start telling the stories, but hopefully lots of you will come along and start to bear witness to these stories and hear them, and we can share that very dark, it has to be said, not family friendly stories, but so important for them to be told.
Yeah, so if you are watching this at some point in the future, or you're watching it now and you'd really like to dive into the history of the witches, we have a new tour that is starting on the 1st of April called Witches, Trial and Truth, and it will be running every Saturday, I believe.
Yes.
And if you want it to be extra special, you can join our very first one this coming Saturday.
Yes, please do.
Tania herself would be your storyteller.
Yes.
So, I mean, you really can't get much better than that.
Oh, okay. Yes, I hope to see some of you there. It would be great. Yeah.
Yes. So if anyone has any questions, we'll hang around for a couple of minutes. You can just type it into the comment section. We'll see it pop up. But if not, thank you so much for joining. And if you're watching this in the future, I hope you enjoyed. And if you're watching it live, I hope you enjoyed.
Yeah, so we've had a question coming about John Kincaid and his witch pricker. So John Kincaid was a witch pricker, or we call them witch prodders here in Scotland, and they used these very long pins, and they would push them into various places on the accused body. The idea being that where the devil touched you, it could leave a mark, but it could also leave this area that would be numb if you pricked it with a pin. So they would prick the accused witches with these over and over again, and as soon as they found a place that didn't hurt, they didn't, of course, assume that was your brain chemistry eventually cotting on to the fact that you're going through this and switching your pain receptors off. No, that would mean you were a witch. And the witch prickers were one of very few people who actually made money from these witch trials, because so they were paid per witch that they found. So guess what? They found a lot of witches. And John Kincaid, it was discovered. So I think the person who asked the question was asking about a retractable pin. Now, I don't know for definite if he did use a retractable pin. I have heard versions of that, and that he wasn't the only one doing so. But what we do know is that he was certainly saying that he had found these marks on people, these areas on people, when in actual fact he hadn't. And we also know that he was in some cases carrying out these investigations without the warrants. So everything had a process that you had to stick by. It wasn't just a matter of, like we see in movies, of pointing your finger and shouting witch, and that was you. Everything had to have the right paperwork, essentially, and he didn't have the warrants that he should have had for a lot of these witch proddings. So he was actually investigated. He was locked up in the toll booth, which I quite like, because there were so many witches he had examined. But despite it being found that he had done these things, he'd been lying essentially, the only punishment he got was to pay a fine, a huge fine, which just goes to prove how much money he'd actually been making.
I hadn't even considered the monetary side of things.
It doesn't make a lot of money at all. The witches themselves, so the accused, had to pay for the fire on which they were burnt, believe it or not. If they couldn't pay it, then it would come from their family or from the local villages would have funds just in case they ran. Very few people actually made money because it was a very expensive process. But the witch prickers, they did. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So someone asking about a Wiccan. A Wiccan is a far more modern type of witchcraft. And I'm not the one to speak, but I'm not a Wiccan myself. I'm pagan, and many people who I know are also pagans and are Wiccans. So it's a type of witchcraft, for the sake of today's conversation, that it is very different to what witchcraft was seen as at the time. There was no version until more modern times of a kind of white witchcraft, or any of that kind of terminology, which is probably the type of association that we can have with Wiccans. Wiccans tend to be very peaceful, loving people, and if they were to describe themselves to people who know nothing about pagan paths, Wiccanism, witchcraft, they may well call themselves a white witch. But that is very different to what witchcraft was at the time. So witchcraft at the time was very much malevolent. It was using forces of evil. So completely separate for Wiccan or any of the other kind of schools of modern day witchcraft that we have today. Yeah. I hope that helps and answers a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you want some kind of visuals to go along with that, how they thought about witchcraft at the time, there are a lot of kind of illustrations from the time that depict the witch trial, especially in relation to James VI. And so you can see in a lot of times it'll be kind of groups of women being kind of visibly punished and things like that. So you can always go look that up as well. We've shared many things on our social media as well. We always post about a lot of things since we are a history-based company, and so we do like diving into that history, so you can always go through any of our social media as well, because we tend to share those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much to everyone who has commented and sent in your questions. If you do have more questions after the fact and we're no longer live, you can always, comment again on our social media, or, message us, or you can always come on tour, and you'll always be able to, at the end, ask your storyteller more questions.
Ask me in person.
Yes, ask me in person. It's always fun. I can vouch for that. So Tania, thank you so much for sitting down and joining. This has been very fun, and hopefully we'll be doing some more live streams in the future. So if you have any topics to request, please do share. And again, so our tours for the Witches Trial and Truth is starting this Saturday on the 1st of April, and it will be running every Saturday, and we're very, very excited for it and hope that you are too. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.